because you're jumping back into the gap. Outlet to coach, it's either sideline, 2 on the side, 3 on the side. That's off the second cut. Leads the country in offensive rebounding.
Hey coach, welcome to the Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Oliver. Let's share the game. Welcome to the Basketball Podcast. I'm here with Frank Dehel, founder and CEO at DribbleHandoff, and a great sharer of so many things, certainly online. And if you don't follow at DribbleHandoff, definitely do. Some real great insights on the analytics and how to coach the modern game of basketball. So welcome to the podcast, Frank.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So we're going to dive into a whole bunch of things, and you and I have talked many times, and we thought the most interesting thing to cover is a topic that you have some real interesting insights into, and that's how to basically sharing underutilized strategies that increase win percentage with coaches of all levels. So that's going to be exciting. But let's just start quick, Frank. Give us a little bit of your background so people know how you've come to this analytics business.
Yes. So as you said, I created DribbleHandoff in 2017 to share those underutilized strategies that increase win percentage. And before that, I've consulted for a number of D1 college basketball teams, including Duke during their 2015 championship run, as well as a 2-year stint at St. Joe's for Coach Martelli as the director of basketball analytics.
Great background, some wonderful people to be around. And, all that leads to, some of these underutilized strategies. And obviously that's the key. I mean, I think everyone's aware of analytics and their importance. And then some people are probably a little bit fascinated about how they can apply analytics a little bit more, because that's clearly the challenge at a little bit of the lower levels, is just having the resources to do it. So let's get into these strategies. What's the first strategy to be able to, maximize your win percentage?
Sure. Chris, before we even get there, I would like to share with you my philosophy on how I arrive at these strategies, if I can.
Absolutely.
So my personal philosophy is, if we follow the herd, we will not be a good or a great team. We will be average. We will be part of the herd. So we have to start thinking about problems differently and not doing things just because. And there's a great quote that I heard a few months ago that really stood out to me. And that's, just 12% of people go to lunch because they're actually hungry. The other 88% go because it's 1 o'clock. And what that means is we can't do something just because other coaches are doing it. We have to do things. We have to implement strategies because it makes sense. It's logical. Data backs it. And it provides us with a competitive edge. So that's where my philosophy is in creating these underutilized strategies.
Well, and that seems to be, a general theme of this podcast is that there's a lot of divergent thinkers on this podcast. So I think it goes well with all the different coaches that we've had on, and, to stimulate people's thinking about some things they can do differently.
Absolutely. And another thing I will point out is another reason that I've created a lot of these strategies. When I've studied what impacts winning the most, I have found that there's number one reason why teams win games. 82% of games won are won by the team with the higher effective field goal percentage in that game. So shooting really wins games. It's a strong determinant in who wins that game. So a lot of my strategies will impact in some way offensive or defensive effective field goal percentage.
And basically, whatever you focus on in terms of the offensive strategy, the reverse would be true for the defensive strategy, which they go hand in hand, right?
Absolutely.
I love that. That simplifies the process for a lot of people. And really, again, gets to some practical things, because everything we're going to talk about is something that we can actually apply. This isn't something that's a theory. This is an application.
Yes, and it's applicable at all levels. I will reference NBA data and NCAA D1 data. But really, that is just because those are the most reliable data sources available to us. But these are strategies that, like I said, are applicable at every level.
Well, let's talk about that too, because there's so many coaches that say, oh, well, that works in the NBA or that works in the NCAA, that won't work at my level. But the reality is that they just have so much more data than we have. And that's why we can extrapolate things from their data, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's so many great minds at the NBA level that we can really see these underutilized strategies present themselves first at that level, and then we can add them to our level.
Well, that's what I say. They're full-time coaches. I mean, they get to spend every minute of the day thinking about these problems and finding solutions. So there's no question that there's validity to what the NBA does. So
absolutely, Chris.
The first strategy. Let's get into it. Let's start with the one that I know is popular on everyone's mind, and that's the mid-range shot. What are we talking about in terms of that?
The mid-range, this is the most common of the strategies that I'll share with you today, Chris. However, I think this really builds a strong foundation for where we will go during this podcast. And the mid-range shot, it's a highly inefficient shot, and its frequency is declining year over year. However, in order to understand that, we have to understand why it's so inefficient. And to do that, we can use something called an expected point value to compare that shot location to other shot locations on the floor. And to do that, to calculate that expected point value, we take that shooting percentage of that location and multiply it by the points that it's worth, a 2 or a 3. Now I've analyzed all of these shot locations, and I have found that the D1 level, mid-range is hit at a 36% clip over the last 5 years. It's worth 2 points, so it's worth 0.72 expected points. But that doesn't mean that much without knowing what these other shot locations are worth. So starting at the rim, that shot's worth a 1.19 expected points. And shots from 3, they're hit at a 34, 35% rate. So they're worth 1.04 expected points. But coaches, they know this math. And for that reason, the mid-range is dying. If you look at D1, NBA, the mid-range percent each year is declining. And it's commendable for college coaches because it's actually much lower in college basketball. College basketball actually takes about half of the mid-range shots that the NBA does.
So what you're saying is it's true. The mid-range is dying.
Yes.
So what do we say to a coach who's resistant? I know the data, you say the data, and I mean, that's the truth. So beyond the data, like how do we frame this to players and coaches to understand it more? Is there a next level of understanding to this?
There is. I think for the best way to split it out is explaining it to coaches and explaining it to players. In terms of explaining it to coaches, I would share with them the model that I created for mid-range. And what that model does is it takes into account the percentage of shots you take from mid-range. And that model states that for every 5% that we decrease in our mid-range percentage, on average, we get 1 additional win. And that's huge. Every coach is looking for 1 to 2 extra wins. And we're not changing our personnel and our talent level. We're just changing the way we shoot. So that's if we take 12% of our shots from mid-range and drop it down to 7 or 7 to 2. 5% is 1 win, 10%, 2 wins. And I think that's the best way to explain it to a coach that's looking for additional wins.
Well, and I love that because I've had that framed to me by some NBA coaches when they talk about player development, that they can go to a player and they can just say, hey, listen, if you just drop your attempts in this no-no range by this amount, then you know your shooting percentage, your obviously effective field goal percentage, all these things will go up. So there's a direct correlation to these things, which is awesome because then that validates what you're saying.
Absolutely. And then even on top of that, for players, there have been some teams that really like what they've done with these expected point values, where they will tape on the floor the specific expected point values for each location. And I think beyond just sharing that information with a player, putting them on the court really helps drive for players an understanding of these expected points and how valuable threes and shots at the rim are.
And I love this because in a way, the mid-range shot, this is the simplest one to understand, but it builds a good core for the other strategies that you're going to talk about. So we know this data now, and I know coaches will be curious. So What are some good teams to watch so that people can see this strategy be implemented?
That's a great question, Chris. For teams that are looking to really make a change, maybe they take an average amount of mid-range shots and they want to start to become a leader in this trend, I would suggest the Milwaukee Bucks. Last 2 seasons ago, they took the 11th most mid-range shots. Last year, 29th out of 30, so second fewest. And they did it in just one offseason. And their offensive efficiency over that time went from 9th 2 seasons ago to 4th last year. So if you want to find a team that changed it in just one offseason, the Milwaukee Bucks under Coach Bud, they're a great example. And then let's say you're a team that you want to consistently lead your league in fewest mid-range shots. Then I would suggest the Houston Rockets, who for the last 5 years have led the NBA in fewest mid-range shots every single season. So those are 2 good national teams that you can go and study.
Well, the Rockets are certainly a long-time example of that. And Milwaukee's just so fun to watch now. They're playing such great basketball and such modern basketball with their spacing and being in wide sets all the time as well. So
yeah,
let's jump. So mid-range shot, kind of the simplest one to talk about, but builds a good core for other strategies that will follow. So let's jump a little bit. Let's go to the value of the corner. What can we learn about that?
So NBA teams and NBA analysts, they've long talked about the value of the corner 3. And when I've studied these shooting percentages, I saw this again. There is a true value there. Corner 3 shots are made at about a 4% higher rate than above the break 3s. And NBA teams and analysts, they know that. And that's why they discuss this lift. But they've also claimed that this is due to distance. However, when I was looking at the same data for college basketball, I noticed that college basketball, there was a 2.5% lift on the corner 3. And as we know in college basketball, the distance is the same along the perimeter. Therefore, distance can't be driving this lift. And to further prove this, I then studied a 22-foot 2-point shot in the NBA versus a 22-foot corner 3. And if it were distance, we would see that these shots are hit at the same level. However, again, the 22-foot corner 3 is made at a higher rate than the 22-foot 2-point shot.
Well, and that makes sense to me too. I would generally attribute it to the fact that it's often against good defense, the last pass versus rotation. And generally, is there some analytics that support that it's more open usually? It's a more open 3? Or is that something we can define?
That's exactly right. I use data from NBA Savant, which has multiple variables and metrics regarding the actual shot. And what I found is I looked at average number of dribbles, average touch time, and average defender distance. And the corner 3 is on average much less defended or much less contested than the above the break shot. More often catch and shoot. And as you pointed out, analytically or eye test, these are really good shots. So it's more so a byproduct of the possession, as you were pointing out, than it is anything to do with distance or the shot.
So knowing that as a high school coach or AAU coach or college coach, whatever, what are some things that we should be doing then to take advantage of this value?
We should be looking to exploit this in as many ways as possible. And again, I'm going to point out a way that we can gain additional wins using this. I built another model using corner 3s. This time I added in our shooting percentage from corner 3 and our defensive corner 3 percentage, as well as the percentage of shots we take from the corner 3 versus allow. And what I found is the actual shooting percentages themselves are not that predictive in terms of wins. But the number of corner 3s we take and allow, that was highly predictive. So I call that the corner 3 frequency margin. That corner 3 frequency margin is highly predictive. And for every 3% we take from the corner 3 more than we allow, we win one additional game on average. So 6%, 2 additional wins. So that's 1 to 2 wins on top of the 1 to 2 wins we just got from the mid-range. So 2 to 4 wins just on changing the way we shoot. So coaches should be looking to exploit this at their level. Because, Chris, I'll tell you, it's going to go away eventually.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But first part for me in terms of application is, and I see this still all the time at the high school and the college level, especially in the NCAA game, is I don't see people standing in the corner, which is the biggest problem, right? They're spaced to the 45 in the last spacing spot instead of the corner. And certainly internationally in the NBA, there's almost always a corner. And I've talked about a lot the two-side break where there's always a corner. So that's the first step, right, is having someone in the corner. And the second part of that is having someone standing in the corner. Because I don't know, again, is there data on moving to the corner versus already standing in the corner?
Chris, that's a great question and something I will definitely look into for you, hopefully in time for your show notes. But I completely agree with you in terms of that philosophy.
Well, and that's great. And I do think that that's something that some coaches have resisted a little bit in terms of the modern game, is still spacing traditional lane lines and 45s instead of corners and slots or lane lines, whatever you want to call them. So just that extra spacing. So, and we know spacing is offense, so this validates that as well.
Absolutely. And Chris, this is something that over time, teams are catching up to this. So it's imperative that we do act fast on this at our level, because 2 years ago, I was listening to a press conference with Marshall head coach Dan D'Antoni, and he said during his damn analytics rant, as they call it, that the corner three is the best shot in basketball. So coaches are aware of it by becoming aware of it. And actually at the NBA level, from 2000 to 2010, the corner three as a percentage of all threes rose over time. But starting in 2011, it started to drop off. And last year, we saw a significant, historic drop-off.
So for me, I think about this, and it used to be, again, I guess old school principles of defense used to be, okay, if we're going to get beat, we're going to get beat in the last pass to that weak side corner. But thinking about this over the last few years, and certainly with what you're saying here, it makes sense that we're going to put more effort defensively in terms of running people off that last corner or the corner three. That's what this data says defensively, is that we got it. So then there's more value to influencing, if they're going to shoot, to influencing, them to shoot, 45s and above the break or whatever you want to call it. So that makes sense, right?
That's what's driving this decline since 2011. It's that defenses are really now keying in on that, and teams are trying to decrease that corner three frequency margin that we discussed. So it's a battle for these corner three possessions. So at our level, while coaches are still not valuing it correctly, we should be looking to take advantage of it as much as possible.
Another fascinating question to me is, how intentional is this for a lot of coaches? Because, again, a lot of this might be just the influence of trying to defend the three-point line. Maybe a lot of programs aren't as intentional yet, even about defending that last corner spot, as I said. So, intention
Absolutely.
might move towards that even more. So just a fascinating
That's a great point.
Isn't this what we love about coaching, though? That, in analytics, that there's these give and takes that go back and forth. And once one side figures it out, the defense or the offense, the other side has to figure it out too. So it's great. Coach, before we move on to the next one, give me some teams, maybe even the NCAA or NBA that people should watch to really see this exploitation of the corner.
Chris, I would again point to the Houston Rockets. They're another great example. And Middle Tennessee State a few years ago, about 2 years ago, and I can share some of these clips with you in the show notes. They were really good at getting these corner threes.
Well, I love that. And again, this is perfect timing coming into season when we're starting to see the NBA and the NCAA start too. And we can really watch for these things, from an analytics perspective, but also from a coaching perspective to see how some teams are handling these. So I love that.
Yes, completely agree, Chris.
So building off these, the obvious next one is, what is the value of the post up? Should we still be playing through the post, or should we be rethinking post play? Let me know.
That's a great question, Chris. And the post up, it's another inefficient shot, and its frequency is also declining. And what we know, building off of the mid-range shot, this makes sense. And couple that with the fact that defenses have long strategized how to defend the post, bringing help, bringing double teams on the catch, on the bounce. But the post-up shot is only part of the equation. What about the pass out of the post? How efficient are those possessions? They're actually incredibly efficient. They're worth about 0.25 points per possession more than the shot itself. And you might say to me, Frank, you just said that the post-up shot is not an efficient shot. So comparing those two, it doesn't tell us much. So let's compare it to shots that we know to be good looks. Shots off of screens and spot-up shots. Possessions where we get a post pass and the shot following that, they're worth 0.16 points per possession more than these spot-up and catch-and-shoot off-the-catch shots. So it's a really, really good look. It's not just a good, efficient way to play out of the post, but they're some of the most efficient possessions we can get in all of basketball. So as much as we can, we should be looking to play out of the post and get a pass out of the post. And if we are looking to then play for that pass, why not post our best passer? And for most of us, who is that? It's our point guard. And they're also our best decision maker at times. And they can make passes our bigs can't make. They can limit turnovers. So it's a really optimized way of playing out of the post. And that's getting to what is called an inverted offense, by playing our point guard inside in that post up. And we're more ready to play in this style now than we ever were before, given how stretchy our bigs are. Not only can they make more threes, taking more threes, they're more skilled than ever before. So that allows us to play with 3 to 4 players along the perimeter, forces opposing bigs to now have to switch and contain cutters along the perimeter. And eventually there's going to be a defensive breakdown that now our best passer gets to exploit.
Well, and it also speaks to the unicorn in the game, which is these positionless players that have multiple skills and can play in different places. And you think about a Giannis, you think about a Ben Simmons, you think about players like that that can, certainly be really, really impactful down there, down low. So
Ben Simmons is a great example, Chris.
Yeah, and the team I think about a little bit is obviously Golden State. I feel like they've been doing this for years, where they've been throwing it into the post and playing out of the post with no intent to score in the post.
And another team I will give you that I've studied a lot is Villanova with Jalen Brunson. 2 years ago, they had a great inverted offense. And they went to this even in the national championship game with about 2 minutes to go before half against Michigan. I'll send you this play, Chris, but they got to their inverted look, and Brunson finds a cutting Dante DiVincenzo for a wide open layup in a 2-point game. And it was a really big shot. And they went to this throughout the NCAA tournament. It's a really, really good look, Chris.
Well, I love it. And it makes sense to me, again, put your best matchup in the post to a certain extent has been a philosophy that certainly coaches have had in their minds before. But now it's even more of a mindset, put your best matchup who can be a playmaker, not a scorer, but a playmaker.
And to make it a true win-win, when that guard can actually win one-on-one in the post, that's where this becomes extremely, extremely valuable. And when I've talked to the teams that inverted their offense the best, they all pointed out one thing. Guards don't practice post defense as much as wings and bigs do. So our guards that practice post moves offensively, they're at a huge advantage. And then when I studied the most efficient guards on post-ups that met my post-up threshold, they were all 6'3" or taller. And that's not random. Coaches and teams, they're looking to exploit a height advantage. So when we post our 6'10" big, we're looking to take advantage of a 1 to 2, 3-inch height differential. Well, it's the same thing when posting a 6'3" guard. We're looking for that same 1, 2, 3-inch height differential. And Jalen Brunson's a great example of that. He's 6'3", about 190 pounds. And he also clearly set out to work on those skill sets that we discussed. In his first 2 years, he took 7 post-up shots combined. His junior year, his final year, he took 57. So he clearly set out to work on his offensive post moves.
Well, so, and again, this comes back to, so there's less value to scoring in the post or the value of a post-up shot. And does a lot of that relate to that a lot of these shots end up being, technically not rim attempts? And they may be closer to the basket, but they're often fadeaways. They could be movements away from the basket. They could be highly contested. Is that a part of this equation?
Absolutely. As I put it out before, the post-up going back for so many years has been such a strategized defensive concept. We've always thought about how we're defending the post. There's so much attention paid to the post. So teams, they take so much attention is paid to this that these often become really hard shots. And like you pointed out, they're fadeaways, they're hook shots. So these mid-range shots, they're not as close to the rim as you would hope.
Speaking to the value of the post-up shot, then, we know we have to rethink post-play. Can you give us an example? Because, again, a lot of high school coaches are in this situation. A lot of college coaches are in this situation where they don't have 4 perimeter shooters to play around a player that is going to pass out of the post. So what are some teams to watch to get an understanding of how to play in those situations?
Chris, a great example, I would suggest Xavier, because that's a great point. You might not have a stretch 5, and Xavier doesn't. They have Tyreek Jones. And what they are able to do, they're able to play with 3 players along the perimeter, and they put Tyreek Jones at the dunker spot while allowing their point guard, Paul Scruggs, a bigger guard. He's working that inverted offense, and they're able to play with Tyreek Jones at that dunker spot. And it's really effective. So for teams in that situation, I would study Xavier first and foremost.
No, that's good. It's good to know. Frank, no matter what, a huge part of the modern basketball is pick and roll. I mean, do you have a feel for how many possessions end in pick and roll or involve pick and roll, say at the NBA or the collegiate level?
Chris, that's a great question. And at the NBA level, percent of possessions that end in a ball screen has risen 24% over the last 5 years. And at the college basketball level, D1, it's right in line, 20% over the same time. It's because ball screens are a great way for us to create space. Not just space for our offense, but space for our best playmakers, our best players. And at a minimum, they force a specific decision load onto the defense. There's so many options available that if you try to guard everything, you won't guard everything well. And ultimately, you are forced to concede something while valuing and defending the rest. And I wanted to understand analytically, what should we value and what should we concede? So I broke the ball screen down to 8 options. Our ball handler can take it to the rim. They can take a runner or a floater, or they can take a dribble jumper. And then our screener, they can roll, they can slip, or they can pick and pop. And then we have a third player outside of this. So we can pass to a spot-up shooter, or we can pass to a cutter. And what I found, by far the least efficient option was the ball handler taking a floater or a runner. And the second least efficient, again, the ball handler taking a dribble jumper. And these were by far the least 2 efficient options. And this makes sense. Knowing what we know about the mid-range, most of these shots are coming from the mid-range. And that's what's driving this inefficient option. So as much as we can, we should be looking to concede those options. And when you look at the points per possession for these other 6 options, they're actually highly efficient options. And I'll share with you the chart that I made, Chris. It's a great way to visualize ball screens. And you can add that to the show notes Because these other options, they're really, really efficient. So as much as we can, we should be looking to defend those while conceding those mid-range type looks, those floaters and the dribble jumpers to the ball handler, Chris.
Yeah, that's neat. And there's still the mindset that, we're giving up an uncontested shot sometimes in these drop coverages and these different situations like that. So what do you speak to that? Still, that shot is better to give up than any type of, and again, everything that I've seen is aggressive defense is definitely what gets punished the most. So what do we tell coaches who are worried about giving up uncontested mid-range shots?
Once a team goes into that ball screen, you have to concede something. So by playing the math, you are better off conceding those options. So if that's, depending on the offensive and defensive personnel involved, if that's soft hedge and going over on the screen, it's not necessarily completely uncontested, but you are hopefully forcing that ball handler to choose his least efficient option.
Well, it's great. And again, it speaks to some of these different things that have come up, which is rear contests and obviously the ability to be able to veer in late situations if it gets deep, and these different strategies that teams have come up with. So it's a fascinating give or take in terms of ball screen coverage, because you're going to play against a lot of them. So knowing the ball screen coverage preferences, who are some teams we should look at to help us understand a little bit more this methodology?
Sure, Chris. I mean, the best pick and roll offenses, I would go back and I'd watch Steph Curry and Draymond Green at the NBA level. They're great examples. Even college basketball, going back to that extremely efficient Villanova offense with Jalen Brunson, another great example. If you want to see a team that really understands these values and these 8 options and conceding those mid-range jumpers, I would go watch some of these really analytically efficient teams. Penn is a great example. Steve Donahue really understands these 8 options. So those are some good examples at the D1 and NBA level.
Oh, that's great. And let's discuss switching then, because it's popular, but it's going to become more popular. Is that what we're thinking? It's become more prevalent and then trickle down?
Yes. It's great because it immediately neutralizes the value of that ball screen. But it's about what happens next. And we're starting to see more strategies about that what happens next phase. Because following the switch, there's a potential positional, height, skill set mismatch that can then be exploited. And what we're seeing at the NBA level is we're seeing teams start to exploit this at higher and higher rates. Now, college basketball, my data shows that's remained consistent. The percent of isolations following the switch ball screen has remained consistent over 5 years. At the NBA level, it's risen from 3% to 5%. So it's not really that drastic. But when looking at the postseason, the percent of isolations that follow a ball screen switch has risen from 4% to 13%. So in these really, really tight matchups where the margin for winning is so small, teams are going to this, looking to exploit positional mismatches, or even looking to target defenders to make them work harder, pick up extra fouls, or maybe they're weak defenders. And some teams, James Harden is a great example. He continues to do more of this every year and become more efficient. But then also Chris Paul, LeBron, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry. But then also the flip side of that, as we discussed, there's always the flip side. So defensively, these players can be targeted. And Steph Curry was targeted 10 times more per game in the postseason than he was in the regular season. So as switching does become more prevalent, this is something to watch. How teams isolate their best offensive weapon against a weaker defender.
Well, I guess the question is then, from an offensive perspective, we force a switch, and should we attack it on the perimeter or should we attack it inside? And traditionally, again, based on what you're saying, I would think the perimeter attack would lead to potentially higher value, either, well, a 3 off the dribble, which you can tell me about those analytics too, or a drive and kick situation where you're going to drive the matchup, draw help, and then pass out to an open 3. So is that generally where we should be thinking?
Those are some great ways to exploit this. And it even ties back into what we just talked about with the inverted look. Maybe we are able to even target a weaker defender, someone that we think we can exploit their size. Maybe they're 6 foot and 160 pounds. So now we can get that switch and then have someone like Jalen Brunson back them down to the post. And now we're talking about bringing the help again, or do they stay one-on-one and now we have an easy basket? So there's a couple different ways to attack this.
Very cool. Very cool to know all this. And, again, some really good applications of that as well. And look, I've seen you tweet about it. I want to talk about it because this is something, I guess, close to me in terms of some of my divergent thinking. And that's the value of, can we improve our free throw percentage with increased repetitions? So
Chris,
let's address free throws. Yeah.
In my talks with coaches and assistant coaches and players, one thing was really standing out to me, and it was that the number of free throws practiced in the off season is significantly lower, or it appeared to be lower to me, than during the regular season. So I took an official survey, and I wanted to understand, are less free throw shots taken on a typical week during the off season? And it came out to be true. And because of that, I was then able to test, knowing that we take more free throws throughout the year, does free throw percentage increase over that same time? And looking at it, it was crazy. It actually improved over the course of a year. So looking at college basketball, from November to March, free throw percentage improves every single month of the year. And that's because not only are we now taking more free throws, but it's the compounding effect of that practice, those extra repetitions. And now we're getting game repetitions. So with more repetition comes higher performance levels, increased free throw percentage. And that was really key to me because that shows the value of practice. We should be continuing to practice free throws.
Okay, so you say that, but I want people to think about this in the sense that they shouldn't just practice free throws. They should do it in a way that transfers to the game. Because I would say, of all things, the easiest thing for people to understand is free throws, in terms of that the way we practice them generally does not transfer anything to the game, because we're missing the perceptual information. We're missing the decision-making situation. So this part, to me, of what you're saying makes sense, but based on not more physical practice of the free throws, but more perceptual practice, meaning they're getting game repetitions. And I would argue, and I want you to hear your feedback on this, I would argue you could go the whole year without physically practicing a free throw and increase your percentage throughout the season because you're getting game reps. And game reps are the value. And that's almost impossible to simulate in practice.
Yes. Because of the increased repetition throughout the year and the compounding effect of that, if all practice free throws were held constant, you would see an increase. And then I think the value of practicing them, and then as you pointed out, implementing ways to practice them in the best way possible that translates to the game. Those provide the best lift for us.
Well, and let me give you some counter argument is obviously saying all that, there's value to isolated shooting training, meaning working on shots, working on improvement of shooting, refinement of shooting is valuable, but that's independent of the free throw. That doesn't matter if it's a free throw or three or whatever. Like, there's improvement in terms of that. And where free throws should be more focused is obviously on the psychology of shooting the free throw. So my suggestion, again, want to hear your feedback, is that we should randomize free throws within practice, meaning a coach should randomly call 2 free throws at any point, and then the players go shoot 2 free throws, we chart it, we stat it, And then we get right back into whatever we were doing. And we interrupt practice constantly to shoot the free throws instead of having these really blocked times to shoot free throws, which again, I think is really just comfort and confidence reps.
I completely agree, Chris. Any way that you can get that repetition to resemble a game-like atmosphere, I think that's only going to improve your performance.
Well, and it's such a fascinating thing, and I love that stat, and I'm so glad you shared that with us because I think, again, it does validate what my thinking is on free throw practice.
It's so interesting because as you look at, for example, college basketball, from freshman to senior year, your free throw percentage improves over time. So not only is it improving throughout the specific season, but improves season to season. So as players, the more repetitions we're getting over the course of our career, the better free throw shooters we are becoming. And when I looked at this at the NBA level, I saw the same thing. So take, for example, your first 6 seasons. From October to April, your free throw percentage is increasing every month of the season on average. And then what happens is we see that off-season drop-off. So when that next season starts, yes, that October of your second season, you are shooting a higher free throw percentage than your previous October, but you're shooting it significantly lower than you ended the previous year. So where we're able to start practicing this more year-round and adding this to our off-season workouts, we're going to become better free throw shooters. We can take that trajectory that's already a positive trajectory, but we can turn it more upwards. And we kind of see the same thing in education where students take the summer off and then we have to reteach the same concepts that we ended the year with to start the first 2 months of the school year. I don't want that to happen for us in the basketball world.
Well, and again, awesome support for us finding a more game-like way to practice free throws to try and eliminate that effect from season to season or even month to month. And, and that's the challenge. And that's where I just encourage coaches to constantly look at the psychology of the free throw over the physical action of shooting a free throw. And yeah, this is awesome. And Coach, I want to get to this because I think it's awesome too. And it's, again, a question that I'm curious what you have the answer for. Are we undervaluing defensive players? Because based on everything you've just said, if we follow this analytic path that you talked about and outlined in these 5 other things, that our offense is going to win. So where are we looking at from a defensive perspective?
For me, the best way to understand coaches were valuing defensive players in the same way that they were valuing offensive players came down to minutes per game. That was a great way for me to see how do we value them alike. And in order to understand offensive value and defensive value, I used what's called an offensive and defensive net rating. And what that does is it quantifies your value while on the court, offensively and defensively. And now, sportsreference.com, they have estimates of these. So if you're a team that doesn't track it, using those estimates is better than nothing. But I would suggest actually tracking these. And we can talk about this further later on, Chris, about how to actually track those stats. But those are the 2 metrics that I used to quantify offensive and defensive value. And what I found is, on average, the top, say, 20% offensive players receive 4 extra minutes per game than the top 20% defensive players. And no matter what percentile you look at, the same thing held true. Offensive players, on average, get about 4 more minutes per game than the top defensive players.
This is good stuff. This is really good stuff. So practically then, how does that direct my thinking as a coach? What's the most practical part of that, do you think, for a coach?
Well, first off, it's telling me that we're not playing our most efficient lineups. We are choosing to play offensive players essentially regardless of their defensive value. And I think part of that has to do with the box score. When a coach gets the box score, what percent of those stats are offensive based? So in some way, they serve as an unconscious proxy towards that offensive rating. Whereas we don't have enough defensively regarding the stats that actually matter to quantify their defensive value. So just simply looking at the box score, coaches are more often going to play the more efficient offensive players. And I think in terms of practicality, not only could we get to play our more efficient lineups, not just our most efficient offensive lineups, but this also affects how we recruit at the NBA level, how we pursue free agents, trades. At any level, our player acquisition, we should be looking to value defensive players at the right level. Because if they're being discounted right now, clearly by coaches. So we should be looking to gain that additional competitive edge in that way.
Well, and again, I think especially speaking to a lot of high school coaches that don't have, 5 skilled players, they might have 2 or 3 skilled players, then they have players that play other sports and different things like that. And is what you're suggesting that they should invest the most time in those players in increasing their value as defensive players, instead of focusing on the minimal improvement you can put into, 4 months of basketball practice to improve their offensive skills. If they put all that time into valuing them as defensive players, or increasing their value, as defensive players, is that what you could read from this?
I think the best way to read this is we value shots and points in an unfair way. So a guy that is able to make a clutch shot at the end of a game, they're equally as valuable as someone who is able to defend that and take that shot away at the end of a game. I think we just too often overvalue offense because it's easier for us to see. So yes, in terms of off-season development, everything, we should be looking to develop our defenders as much as possible. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Chris. Not only should we be looking to play them equally, but wouldn't it be easier for us to hide? Don't we have more control by playing a really good defender who is limited offensively? We can find ways to make them effective. We have control over that. But defensively, if we play a pretty good offensive player who is below average on defense, we don't have as much control. Our options are now limited because that offense can now scheme and strategize how they want to go attack that defensive liability. And then that gets into what we talked about with switching and inverted offense. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So by that, I gather the question is it easier to hide an offensive player or a defensive player? Is that what we're getting at?
Absolutely.
So obviously that comes back a little bit to philosophy, what you run on offense, what you do on defense, different things like that. And I would say at the NBA level, clearly the offense can always hunt the matchup on defense. And that's what we're seeing. The question is, are we seeing that enough at the other levels where they're attacking matchups and they're focusing on a specific player? I think at the NBA, like some plays are just called Steph, which just means we're going to ball screens, with whoever Steph is covering, right, to try and force the switch. So I think that type of matchup hunting is happening certainly more at the NBA level. So I would say certainly at that level, it's harder to add. And I think people talk about that it's hard to hide a defender. They can't cover their position, or to be able to cover, I would say, 1 or 2 dribbles in a switch. Right?
Yeah.
And I would say at the other levels, it's a little harder to judge just because, again, as we talked about, the spacing is different. Some teams aren't spacing properly relative to this modern game. And it's probably easier to get into switchbacks and triple switches and different things like that because it allows us to. because of the way the offense is run. So it's not really an answer, but I would say I get asked more frequently about what I do with the kid that can't play on offense than I do with what I do with the kid that can't play on defense. Because I think coaches generally think that defense really can overcome a lot if you can just get a kid to play hard. And I don't think that's necessarily true. That's an oversimplification. But I think that's it, especially coaches with limited time would think that way a little bit in terms of maximizing their team. Do you have any thoughts back on that?
I think that, especially what you discussed even before with Steph, and we pointed out this with regard to the ball screen, I think we see it at the NBA level. We're going to continue to see it at lower levels. So I completely agree with what you've said. Yeah,
and it's again, you just raised so many fascinating things here, and I can't thank you enough for taking time. And I know people who follow at DribbleHandoff know the value that you're sharing, and people that don't, then they'll start to follow you because the main part about all this is that all of us, if we're not already on the analytics train, we've got to get our knowledge to another level. And I'm one of those people. I understand it from a base perspective, but I need to get a deeper understanding because that's where the game's going. And you're there to help us. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it can be a great way for us to see some of these strategies early on that will be relevant for 3 to 5 years. So if we can be early adopters, we can get more value from it.
Well, and that's the whole point of this is some of these underutilized strategies that you shared, coaches get on them, focus on them. And it's really sometimes just as simple as emphasis within your offense. As we come back to say the value of the corner, just getting a player to hold the corner, because the tendency, especially for young players, is to constantly be in movement. And if you can apply that to whatever offense you're running now, is just get them to hold a spot. And such value to some of these strategies, and hopefully coaches will take them. So thanks again, Coach, and we'll connect with you later.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
To find out more about Coach and all we spoke about today, please take a look at the show notes for today's episode. I love to share the game and have basketball coaching conversations, so connect with me on social media. You can find all my social media information and all your membership, clinic, and consulting needs at basketballimmersion.com. That concludes today's episode. I know there are so many podcasts out there. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Basketball Podcast with me, your host, Chris Oliver. Please subscribe and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues so that we can keep bringing you the best of what's out there and share the game.